Coming up next on Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, let's talk about the big hardware stories in 2019 like 7777. How many times can AMD say 7 in the launch of Ryzen 3000? As many times as they can, because Intel's still having trouble moving their process technology. GPUs have gotten affordable, plentiful, and kind of hard to pick. And oh my goodness, SSD prices have dropped through the floor. All that and quite a bit more coming up next on Twitch.
Podcasts you love
from people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 546, recorded for December 26, 2019. Twitch Rewind, 2019's biggest stories in hardware. Affordable GPUs and SSDs sell for 10 cents a gigabyte. 2019 has been a very different year in hardware compared to 2018. Though Intel's fight to 10 nanometer feels just about the same. It's the end of the year. That means it's time to take a look back at the biggest stories in computer hardware. I'm Patrick Norton, joined by Sebastian Peak. And I got to say, MrPCPer.com, what was your biggest story in 2019? What is the story that stirred your soul? What is the one that meant the most to you?
You know,
that's a big
7.7 will live in infamy. July 7th, we had the launch of the Ryzen 3000 processors. We had the brand new architecture on the GPU side from AMD released with the RX 5700 series and a new chipset in X570. That, to me, was the biggest story of the entire year. And, of course, in the background, Intel struggling to get to 10 nanometer and AMD gaining a lot of mind share and market share on the desktop space.
And plus, just sticking it to Intel every chance they could with mentioning 7, 7, 7, yes, and 7, as in 7 nanometer. I got to say, big thing for me was just how huge PC gaming was at CES 2019. And I feel like I haven't read an article about the death of PCs or PC gaming since. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and manufacturers are getting into content creation in a huge way. That was the biggest takeaway I had visiting various booths at CES last year, was just seeing companies like Corsair, and they, of course, acquired Elgato, and you go from station to station, and it's not just about gaming, it's about streaming. And it seems like the two are they're so complementary to each other, and they're actually driving the PC side again.
Right.
So I anticipate that actually being an even bigger story in the coming year.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look back at the biggest stories in the hardware of 2019. ProArt PA32 UCX monitor, 1200 nits, and 1000 zone backlight.
You know,
that's staggering.
Yeah, I started on one side of Asus, and I don't know if you've visited them, but they were in multiple suites. By the time I got to their like professional and like content creator suites, where I saw this monitor, I was blown away by 512 zones in one of the gaming monitors, and then I saw this, and I just stood there kind of with my mouth open for a while, just watching this beautiful 4K footage they had of like scenery and like trees and beaches and things. And there is a depth to, there's a kind of magic to really, really good full array local dimming when it has this many zones, that it's different from OLED. And I have an OLED television, but it's a different kind of a thing. Like and this has the capability of far exceeding the HDR 1000 spec it had in the color depth and as well as the backlight, and the 1200 nit peak brightness is pretty staggering, especially on this 32-inch display. Yeah. But, you know, companies using these very small individual LED lights directly behind the screen, which actually reminded me a lot of the like LG Infinia stuff from way back in like 2009, 2010. And that was what I was lamenting the death of the full array local dimming system when edge lighting kind of took over, and it was like the race to who could have the thinnest television. And it was basically considered too expensive because consumers didn't really understand what the benefit was. And the TVs were a little bit thicker when you have a direct backlighting system. So, but HDR has brought it back. I have HDR to thank for restoring my absolute favorite display technology. And I've seen displays that look pretty good that were limited to maybe a dozen zones where you can at least control like corner lighting and things and dim sections of the screen. But this was, it feels almost like it's pinpoint control over the light when you have that many zones. And 1,000 zones on a 32-inch screen is huge.
Let me put this into context for a second. You know, I think it was Vizio had a couple years ago, Robert and I thought that, basically you can light a monitor from the edge, or you can put, LEDs behind it. And to have the more zones you have, more granular the control you have, right? That's what's part of what's different and what the advantage of OLED is, because you can control individual pixels. So I was going to say, there's the new Vizio, I want to say, is a 65-inch television with 480 zones. And I was absolutely blown away with the idea of a television that big with 480 zones. So we're talking more than twice as many zones in a television, or excuse me, a monitor that's about a quarter of the size of that. So this is an astonishing amount of light control for a screen this size. Moving in this direction, Hisense had an interesting, Robert was talking about this, we were talking about some of the best televisions that came out at CES this year. And Robert was talking about an experiment at Hisense that apparently there were actually engineers from other television companies openly coming up with measuring instruments to test and take pictures, and the Hisense people were apparently just sitting there kind of beaming. And what they did was they took a 1080p panel and laminated it to a 4K panel, a 4K HDR panel, and used the 1080p LCD as the backlighting. So there was one LCD pixel from the 1080p panel to light up each of or 4 pixels of each of the 4K panel in front of it. And it's kind of a wild concept, but it's not OLED, it's not individual pixel control, but it's 2,073,600 discrete zones for a 4K monitor, which is ridiculous and amazing, and I don't know if it's ever going to ship. But to have that level of, one, that amount of brightness, which is pretty staggering, and two, that's did they have like a basic HDR 1000 rating, or were they just kind of, it's brighter than anything we've seen in this size. That level of backlighting gives an extraordinary control over how the monitor looks. I want to go find it now because I'm fascinated.
Yeah, it does have the VESA 1000. They said they exceeded the spec. The spec, I think, was actually shown, like the logo. But yeah, you do have to see it, because you can only sort of try to think about what that many zones would look like on that small of a screen. But like you're saying, the more pinpoint light control you have, and it's reminds me of what Sony did with their Z9 TV. I think that was a couple of years ago now when that was introduced. Right. Where you just have an insane amount of light. Basically, they have a low resolution display made of just white light behind the LCD. And the two are creating the same image at the same time. And the lower resolution image is providing the luminance. And essentially at that point, the LCD is just doing chroma because it is just filtering light. And the result is just staggering. Right. And I hesitate to I don't know the retail pricing, and I'm sure it's probably going to be up there because it's a professional monitor. Let's face it, it's a ProArt monitor, and the amount of money that probably went into R&D.
Right. It would not be unusual for a monitor like this to be $4,000 to $6,000, especially depending on the level of sophistication and the calibration.
Yes, exactly. And for them to be targeting like photographers and videographers, then I don't think that it's a price that, especially if you're creating HD content, like HDR content, I should say. Like this is, close to that professional display where it can do 1,000 plus brightness, and you have that kind of color accuracy and black level control.
Meizu Zero announced a phone this week that literally has no jacks whatsoever. There are 2 pinholes in the entire phone, one of which is for the microphone. The other one is for the reset button, which had me giggling. There's no buttons. There's no headphone jack. There's no power jack. It's wireless charging. It's Bluetooth for your headset. It is all screen controls and using an eSIM. And apparently one of the biggest problems with them rolling this out in China, which is where the sales on this are going to start, is that eSIMs aren't particularly well supported in most of China. And I was like, that's one way to make sure you can, reach production and capacity. But it looks, it's kind of curious to look at because it is absolutely tiny. And, part of me is, this is kind of like laying down a gauntlet. Like, hey, Apple, you thought you were eliminating all of the ports.
Then Apple responds by releasing a phone that doesn't have a display. You're like, ha!
Could be. Well, this one, this is kind of behaving like the Sony OLED TVs that came out last year, where the screen itself acts as a speaker. So the screen on this phone is acting as a speaker. I'm very curious as to how functional and or awkward that will be when sort of all of the audio is coming, most of the audio is going into your cheek perhaps, or maybe you hold the phone all the way up over your ear, or maybe you just use a headset, get your Bluetooth on. Pricing
phone
information is a little...
You have to actually press it into your ear to hear audio.
Just wait until they're implanting phones at the mall, man. Well, the malls won't be there.
That's coming.
They're implanting phones at the big box store.
All we need is a tiny device that connects to Amazon, and then we just, have a guide us, and we don't even need to look at a screen, and she can read me my text messages. And,
Bezos doesn't.
Why do we need these giant things in our pocket? We just need voice and from an implant in our heads.
All you need is a jack just at the top of the skeleton, at the base of the top of the spinal column, at the base of the skull, and just let Amazon take care of you. Amazon will deliver your scop.
Just give in. My body is going to have like Amazon buttons on it, like paper towels, laundry detergent.
AMD Radeon 7 announced at CES. Kind of a surprise for me that I was thinking we would get hardcore Ryzen, 3000 news and maybe some light. This is the future of the AMD GPU platform. I had it completely backwards. There was a whole lot of AMD 7 and the mention of 7 nanometer, and anywhere Dr. Su could mention 7, especially in reference to nanometer and process, just to kind of dig a fork, I think, into Intel and probably NVIDIA. Certainly based on some of the reactions we saw at NVIDIA, not something they expected to be announced at CES. And, not that I don't love the 2060, but this was a pretty big announcement compared to the 2060. I didn't expect cards to show up this fast. Was this kind of a surprise, or did you leave with a card at CES, or can you talk about any of this? Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the card is behind me. They shipped these out, like all the reviewers' kits that came on these nice acrylic stands with LED lighting were shipped out after the fact. I didn't have mine until about a week before this release, I think. And so it's kind of a blur. I don't really remember days anymore. But like you said, it was a surprise. I was expecting, we were hearing rumors about new processors. We were thinking it was going to be Zen 2, like Ryzen 3000 series CPUs. And I was like, to the point where I was creating tables based on like leaked specs so I could have stuff ready for the news post. And I'm watching the keynote, and then this comes out. So, and Lisa was talking about the move to 7 nanometer, and I'm like wondering, is this like new graphics architecture? What is going on here? And the thing that we maybe would have expected is maybe like a high-end graphics solution coming later on, and we would see the CPUs first. But it's obviously, like you said, it's flip-flop. Like the opposite is what happened here.
Right.
But this is still a really interesting product. Like architecturally, for those that follow such things, this is not breaking new ground. There's not a bunch of new graphical features, that sort of thing. What this is optimized, refined, and as they say, supercharged Vega. So the Vega 10 core was the thing that powered their previous high-end graphics, the RX Vega 64, and like workstation graphics like the Radeon Frontier Edition. And what Radeon 7 is it's basically the consumer version of they have a line of products called Instinct, the Radeon Instinct products of like their workstation compute cards. So this is based on the same Vega 20 core found in the Instinct MI50 workstation card. So what this is, actually fewer compute units are enabled on this versus Vega 64, which surprised me at the beginning. So you have fewer stream processors, 3,200 or 3,840 enabled versus the full 4,096. And so at the outset, just looking over the specs, I'm thinking, is it just clock? So the move down to 7 nanometer would allow them to shrink the die. It shrunk considerably from 495 millimeters squared down to 331 millimeters squared. And the extra space on that interposer on this chip is now filled with 2 additional stacks of 4 gigabytes of HBM2 memory, the high bandwidth memory.
Whoa.
And that was the big change, because when you add stacks of HBM2 on this architecture, they're adding memory controllers. So it went from 2 memory controllers to 4 memory controllers, which literally doubles the memory bandwidth. And then they actually boosted the memory speed as well. So slightly faster memory. So we go from a little under 500 gigabytes per second total bandwidth with Vega 64 to a terabyte of memory bandwidth with Vega 20 and of course the Radeon 7. So just
wow.
If there was any bottleneck at all to Vega before, I can imagine that it's got to be gone. So not only do you have just ridiculous amounts of bandwidth, but you have more graphics memory, more frame buffer than we've ever seen from a consumer graphics card at 16 gigabytes. So just all sorts of questions about what the performance would be like. Obviously, AMD allowed reviewers to sort of tease the card, show pictures of the card, unbox the card back on the 4th, but we couldn't share any performance numbers until today. And so I spent a day with the card at 2560 by 1440, and I spent a day with it running 4K tests. And basically right off the bat, what I was seeing was performance right in between an RTX 2070 and an RTX 2080, with the 2080 still having a pretty healthy lead with synthetic benchmarks anyway. And as I moved on to gaming, I thought, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that would explain some of the NVIDIA reaction at CES, which a friend of mine referred to as like, wow, that was quite a tantrum, one of the public postings that came out. That's a huge jump in terms of AMD performance. Now, this isn't an inexpensive card, but neither are the 2070 or the 2080. And it's like in one fell product jump, they've gone from sort of middle of the pack to awfully close to the fastest card you can buy today. That's a huge jump.
I mean, if you look at, obviously, I didn't do any testing with the 2080 Ti because that's just in another like stratosphere of cost.
Sure.
At $1,000. The RTX 2080 and this Radeon 7 are both $699 cards. And while AMD is offsetting the cost, as GPU makers will do with a game bundle, and there are 3 like top tier games that's worth $180 to kind of subsidize that price, there is absolutely still a bit of a pricing issue with this if you're just looking at the raw performance. And if you read the review and go through all the charts, what you'll see is for AMD optimized games, like Far Cry 5, like Ashes of the Singularity Escalation, this is right up there trading blows with the 2080. Like in Far Cry 5, like one of my tests, I think I had it out on top. It depends on resolution. Like 4K, it was like in second place, or 1440, it might be in first versus second. But in those games, it's right up there. So you have to think like a certain amount of its potential performance is going to be how well optimized the software is to take advantage of this particular kind of hardware. Like this is unusual hardware that, having this much memory and having this much memory bandwidth, this is significantly different from how you could handle things like high resolution textures and higher resolutions and things. So there is more room to push this card than I was even able to test, even at 4K, because my 4K testing is at pretty modest settings, like standard, normal preset settings, nothing high. And it was still a little bit better overall at 4K than it was at 1440. So then I have to wonder, like, what if I enable all like optional HD textures, push the resolution even higher? NVIDIA and AMD both have this technology. DSR is what it's called on the NVIDIA side, and ASR, I think, on the AMD side. It's basically oversampling. Like, you render off screen at a higher resolution than your monitor can actually handle, and then it's basically downsampled at the display engine level to your monitor, so you end up with like an entire screen anti-aliasing sort of effect. It's basically what Apple does with their Retina displays on Macs. So you can do that with these graphics cards in certain supported games, but you run into a wall with video memory very fast. So that's one of the things that they had talked about was you can do that. You can do dynamic resolution and actually avoid hitting the 8 gigabyte wall that you would get with the NVIDIA card at the same price. So they're kind of looking for ways, it seems, on the gaming side to make use of this much frame buffer, which is just an unprecedented amount of memory, like I said. Mm-hmm. But at some point, you're more constrained by the power of the GPU than you are the amount of memory that you have.
The Cooler Master Hyper 212, which I guess is the 212 if you want to read it the long way. The whole idea of updating this seems so strange because it's such a classic. It's one of like 2 or 3 coolers that kind of said, you don't have to spend a lot of money to keep your processor cool unless you're an insane overclocker. What's going on with this one?
Well, like you said, I mean, the 212 Evo, if you've shopped for a cooler in the last, 5 years, it's been probably number 1 on Amazon for as long as I can remember. It's just the go-to aftermarket cooler for just about everyone, and it works with almost every platform. They've updated it over time to encompass newer CPU sockets. The version of it that I bought, it works with like the 2011 socket and all the Intel and AMD sockets. So and as good as it is, and as cheap as it is for its high performance level, we're talking the $30 to $35 range.
Right.
It was not a perfect product. It got the job done, and people lived with things like its sort of idiosyncratic mounting system, which involves if anybody knows this cooler, they know the X-shaped sort of spring-loaded thing that you have to sort of compress and snake through the heat pipes and then open it again, and it has to be on the right side because there's a little nub, and you have to like line it up, and you have to pull it back out if you didn't get it right. Anyway, once you got it mounted, well, it's the way it worked, and once you got it mounted, the performance was fantastic, and you couldn't really argue. But the update,
every cooler should have a reverse Hasenpfeffer load.
The update, it basically takes it to the next level in every way. It's a cosmetic improvement. If it's a performance improvement, as we'll discover, and the mounting mechanism has been completely changed and is now on a par with something that you would expect to see from like Noctua, where now the bottom has these dedicated brackets that you select whether you want the AMD or the Intel style. You attach them to the base with screws. So now you have this solid all metal foundation, which very securely mounts on 4 points. You're not using a separate piece like the brace that they used with the original design that only had actually 1 point of contact in the very center of the block. Now this is more down like every other higher end cooler is. And it's got this really sharp, like stealthy kind of appearance with a black nickel coating, no more exposed copper heat pipes. The whole thing looks a lot more expensive than this is. And you can get it with or without an RGB fan. I was sent the one that had an RGB fan. And you can attach this to your RGB header on your motherboard. And if you don't have one of those, it came with a little control It's how actually I tested it. That lets you just connect it to a Molex power connector from your power supply, and then use a little remote to switch through the different colors and that sort of thing. But completely optional, of course. And once this thing was mounted, and I brought out the old 212 again and did fresh testing just so I could have a true A to B comparison on the test platform. And this was about a degree cooler with exactly the same thermal compound, same CPU. And I attribute that to just a little bit more secure of contact against the CPU from the new mounting system. But the sound, the actual noise output is so much lower from this. Under load, we're talking about the same noise output as one of those Intel stock coolers, which are pretty quiet, 38.5 decibels. And the Hyper 212 Evo, as great as it is, has always been a little bit louder under load, around 45 decibels. And this is about the same 2,000 RPM limit on the fan. It's plus or minus 10% from the PWM fan, but going at about 1,920 or so RPM under load, 38.5 decibels. You're not going to hear this in a case, and you're not going to hear it over pretty much any GPU. So it's, and the most amazing thing to me was like, oh, it has this nice plate on the top, and it's got the black nickel finish, and they're offering it with an RGB fan. It's going to be really expensive now. And no, like when I looked before publishing the review, it was $35 on Amazon. So we're talking about the same price range, that $30 to $35 price range, and just a refinement in every way and much quieter. So whether you get the one with the plain black fan or the RGB fan, it's just a win. Like I said, they knocked it out of the park with this one. It's everything that a product upgrade should be. Like it's actually exciting. We're talking about a $35 cooler, but it is exciting. And I think this sets the standard for that budget cooler for a long time, just like the 212 Evo did, where that was the cooler. Like if you bought a processor that didn't come with one, like Intel, since the 6th gen, hasn't been shipping coolers with any of their unlocked processors. And,
Right.
you know, Intel, AMD actually has some decent stock cooling, but this kind of takes it to the next level. There's not really anything that this can't cool. I mean, you wouldn't put this on a Threadripper system, but it doesn't offer that compatibility. But, you know, I'm not going to go Tom Cruise on you and talk about frame interpolation. But just as a PSA for anybody watching, if you see someone that you love taking vertical video, tell them to take their phone and turn it horizontally. They'll thank you for it later. And maybe you have to play around with it, because maybe halfway through the video wasn't the right time to turn. There we go. To turn the video. But going the wrong way. But
Well,
you can fix
so
it in software later, but there's nothing you can really do about a vertical video, like those Instagram videos. I know that certain artists like Taylor Swift, I think last year, released a vertical music video, and it only worked properly if you're using like the Instagram app, I think, because YouTube just black bars on the sides.
if you're Taylor Swift, you can do that, yo.
Yeah,
this is just, you know, it's a good read up at Fast Company, because the authors, I feel like they are being sarcastic in a very subtle way, but actually they're not. They're just.
I like that it's called. I want this insufferable TV for millennials. Like, fine, I'll take it.
If you can't see the video, what you're looking at is a screen oriented in the vertical position, or what we used to call the portrait mode. And this is the vertical, a new 43-inch TV from Samsung. Apparently, it's going to cost a healthy and outrageous $16,000.
I hope that's not in American dollars. Like, it's a 43-inch TV on a swivel mount. I'm pretty sure there are computer monitors that can do that now for like $1,500. Maybe not 43 inches, but you know, $200 monitors have tilt and swivel.
Well,
mounts.
if you do use one of the social networks that pushes vertical video, this will give you the chance to watch it massively without the big bars on the right and left side. I don't know what else to say about this. It's
yeah, you and I know a little bit about home theater and about, you know, people who use projectors and screens. And there's an entire market for like the convertible, like having a projector that has a preset for your anamorphic, like your ultra wide, and then your 16:9. And there are people who go all out and they get curtains and actually like, you know, they cover the sides if they're not watching a CinemaScope, like a 2.35 or 2.4:1. And it's just, I would rather see something like LG's TV that like retracts down into a box. Maybe just have it like retract a certain way for widescreen presentations and move itself somehow for a vertical orientation. But this is literally just a swiveling 43-inch display. And it's useful. I mean, I've seen vertical TVs used in like offices and obviously in airports and things, because that's how it more effectively displays a lot of content. But just turn your phone horizontal and you don't need to worry about this.
This is something I'm incredibly excited about, and someday I'll actually get it to the center of the screen. Raspberry Pi Model 4, which you're not going to be able to see streaming as the colors change. But there is USB-C on this critter. There is micro HDMI on this critter. There are more ports on this critter. It is an exciting update. None of which, as I reach for the mouse for the Raspberry Pi instead of for the laptop I'm connected to, none of which is nearly as exciting as the fact that they put a whole bunch more memory on this beast. And if you've been looking for more performance, this is pretty exciting. 1, 2, or 4 gigabytes of RAM options. Like I mentioned before, USB-C for the power supply, 2 micro HDMI supports supporting up to 2 4K displays, USB 2, USB 3, gigabit Ethernet is on the board now. This is a whole lot of updates to my favorite single board computer. There are a lot of other single board computers out there. And we've talked about many of them. The advantage of the Raspberry Pi has, of course, is the huge amount of support, the huge community that's developed around it. It may not be as powerful, or at least in the past was not as powerful. But if you were new to, the Linux environment, or you were a Linux noob, or you just didn't want to run Linux at all, and you just wanted to download something and install on the Raspberry Pi, there are so many packages and so many options to turn this little box right here into a pretty slick appliance, whether you're talking about streaming Plex or using it as an audio streamer or using it for, monitoring the bathrooms in your office and switching lights on and off to let people know when they could walk the 60 yards across the office without without being denied. Oh man, yeah. 4 gigabytes of RAM, I think, is really, 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 really huge. I am kind of ridiculously excited about that.
The market agrees with you on that 4 gigabyte of RAM choice, by the way. I think it was that same day when this launched a couple days ago that it was unavailable, at least from the outlets I checked. It was out of stock this morning when I was looking.
This is pretty normal for a Raspberry Pi launch. They launch it, everything sells out, they refill the channel, and over time it slows down. It's interesting. You can back order on Newark, which is Element 14. It's exciting. I like Raspberry Pis. Having more memory is a really, really big deal to me. Let me say it one more time. It's available with up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. And it's a much more powerful. It feels like, I haven't benchmarked it yet. It feels like a much more powerful in day-to-day use processor. I don't believe it's that big of a gap. So it may actually simply be the memory update that is making it so smooth to do things like, operate more than one application at a time and switch between them without going... I will say that my favorite uses for Raspberry Pis are still dedicated distros that are acting as, for me, one of my favorites, of course, is dedicated audio streaming devices, connecting a Raspberry Pi to a small DAC and using that to distribute music around my house or power a DAC to power a unit. Reboot times are also really fast, I'm noticing. Because I just relaunched it after an operating system update. So I'm kind of like, I'm excited.
I want to make these I Survived 7.7 shirts and then send them out to all the other editors too. I thought about adding some incomprehensible, garbled nonsense after that to sort of pay tribute to what was happening on my keyboard. It was about 6:45 a.m. early morning of the 7th. I'd pulled an all-nighter and I was trying to finish everything, and I literally was at the keyboard trying to type a word.
Speaking
I don't
in
remember which
tongues.
word it was. Yeah, and it was just like every key was wrong. Like, what is this? HYT, what? And I finally just passed out, woke up again at 8:30, freaking out to go proofread the review again and make sure it got up on time. But yeah, I think everybody kind of drove themselves to distraction with this. If you think about it, you asked where to begin. Well, let's see. New Ryzen processors, new graphics cards released on the same day from AMD with a new architecture. Both of these are brand new architectures. And then a brand new platform, the X570 platform. And oh, by the way, right in the middle of this, the Super came out, the NVIDIA Super. And of course, we didn't have a show last week, so we didn't talk about that. But that came out on the 2nd. So,
Well, we were sort of overwhelmed. It was such an, is it cold to call it an underwhelming announcement? Well, okay, let's start. I have this note in the rundown from earlier this week. Oh, hey, AMD 3950X ships with a crappy BIOS, which is okay because you won't find one for sale anyhow. And we'll talk about that not being able to find one for sale in a minute. You got. You got hands-on with the 3700X, the 3900X. Supposedly the 3950X shipped, although I don't know if any shipped outside of Micro Center stores in part of the U.S. I joked with you like, oh, I should have stayed up till 1 a.m. last night like I usually do, because then I might have been able to order off of Newegg one of the new 3000 series AMD Ryzen 7 processors, which were all sold out by like 6:15 in the morning when I found the email from Newegg. So you called it disruptive force, which to me sounds like, ooh, that must be so delete expletive fast. But it was a really mixed experience. Pound. Sometimes benchmarking is really painful, and I wish they finished products before they ship them. I mean, is that a safe assessment at this point, or are things cleaning themselves up?
There's two issues. One, the platform. So AMD sent out reviewers kits, which included processor, memory, motherboard. And if you were using the supplied X570 motherboards, depending on which ones you got, there were some issues with one of them. There were issues with I only got two. So the one was completely unusable. The other one worked, except it didn't boost. There was no turbo boost. It was reporting 3.8 gigahertz on the 3900X as the base and boost clock speed. And I was like, it's just being misreported. So I started running benchmarks. And I was watching core behavior during the benchmark runs, and it wasn't moving above 3.8. It was actually going down to 3.79. So something was definitely wrong.
Overclocking.
Yeah. It's the new negative boost. And that was obviously a problem. So I think
this
on the 5th, they released an update to this, but we're talking like firmware updates coming down between the 7th and 5th, and even some of them coming down as late as the 6th or 7th for a launch of 7.7, when reviewers, in theory, would have had time to benchmark all this stuff. I was holding out to the last possible minute, and then I still got hit with issues and firmware updates on the 5th. So,
well, so this is one of the reasons why so many companies, for example, classic example, Apple, they want to control things. They want to have the best possible experience. So they decouple the launch dates for products as much as possible from any sort of like, it's going to ship on, or, this day. Not entirely true, but certainly, they no longer like, we're going to have a new thing at Macworld. We're going to have a new thing at this event. Roughly speaking, they do announce the new phones and stuff at given times. But they had some issues with firmware when they launched the original Ryzen processors. Mostly that was around memory speed and overclocking, not as vicious as this. Is this a reason not to buy this processor at this point? Or maybe to sort of wait for 570 motherboards to be a little bit more finished?
I think this was mostly just an issue that reviewers encountered, that retail boards, like the one board I had an issue with was an MSI board. There was a resistor problem. Something was wrong in the pre-release version. The retail version does not have that problem. I was talking to their support guy in Taiwan, and it's just basically the stuff that they had to work with leading up to the launch, there were some issues that have been fixed at this point. The one major issue, and I would say like there's absolutely nothing wrong with the processors. Like I would say either wait on X570, or if you already have like a 2000 series processor, to update the BIOS if you encountered any issues. You know, it really, any X570 board you get will be in some sort of bootable state, so you can at least update to the newest firmware. One of the things that happened over the last few days, and this was on Twitter, I know some of the reviewers from AnandTech who did the CPU review over there, the AGESA code changed version. So from the second, and starting on the second, depending on the manufacturer, and leading up to the 5th, that's when my Asus BIOS came down. It went from 1.0.0.2 to 1.0.0.3a, and there's a 3ab, and these affect things like the boost behavior and that sort of thing. So if you don't have the latest BIOS, if you get an X570 board, just update it. They all have it at this point, just on their regular like customer support download pages. So, but once you have that installed, you're getting the full performance out of these CPUs. And X470 is a great solution for these too. I ended up having to do my testing on X470 because of my stability and some memory issues I was having with the one board. And I had absolutely no issues running on an X470 board with the 3700X, the 3900X, running 3200 DDR4. Absolutely flawless, no blue screens ever, no stability issues at all. So I don't think there's an issue with these CPUs. The only, well, other than availability, but if you can get your hands on one, even if you only have a 400 series board, perfectly fine. And then the X570 boards, you know, are fine too. Just make sure you update them and you'll get proper boost behavior. So it, like I said, retail channel, a different story from what the reviewers were facing with these pre-release products, where they're just kind of rushing them out there.
What did you think of the 3900X compared to the 2700X and compared to what's available from Intel?
If you look at some of the charts, the 3700X and 3900X have tremendous performance. Depending on the benchmark, they sometimes even lead on single core performance. But really where their bread and butter is going to be multi-threaded. So if you have a multi-threaded workload, and, you know, Cinebench numbers, that sort of thing are what they are. And of course, the 3900X absolutely dominates that. But depending on your workload, you're getting just phenomenal power from this because it's 12 cores. If you compare it against anything on Intel's desktop side right now, where it tops out at 8 cores, 16 threads with the 9900K currently for around $500, 3900X at the same price point, if you can find it, you're getting the benefit of all those extra cores, which that's everything. So it's 4 more cores, 8 more threads, and it looks like it in the benchmarks. It's not like this is falling short of the 9900K, even though it looks faster on paper. It looks faster on paper. It's faster in real life, depending on the benchmark. And we'll talk about gaming, but just for any of the quick benchmarks I was able to run, I did as many as I could, but you're talking about things like video compression or transcoding, compression, decompression with 7-zip. I ran one of the older CPU POV Ray. It's a CPU-based ray tracing benchmark, Cinebench, just to get a feel for what these could do in single and multi-threaded performance versus Intel. And it was great. I mean, the older POV Ray, Intel kind of wiped the floor on single core, but then of course you go to multi-thread, which is how you're actually going to be running it, and it just destroys the $500 9900K. So they definitely lived up to the promise of the benefits of the new architecture, and moving to 7 nanometer, they're able to do things like the 3700X, which is only a 65 watt part and frequently outperforming a 9900K, which is rated at 95 watts, but everything consumes more power under these bigger loads. Like Cinebench is almost a power virus when it's running in all core mode. But the 65 watt 3700X was not pulling very much power out of the wall, even under that kind of stress. I think the total was around 130 watts, which includes the motherboard, the chipset, the memory, and then the inefficiency of the power supply, which in this case I think was only a gold-rated power supply. So you have to discount that as well. But just very, very impressive. 132 watts from the wall was the 3700X. And if you
That's
look
impressive.
and look at like the previous generation, the 2700X was pulling 203, exact same motherboard, exact same power supply,
Right.
everything the same, except I swapped out the CPUs, ran the test again. You're going significantly better performance than a 2700X for the same price, yet you're drawing 70 fewer watts in the process and don't need the same kind of cooling. Like the 3700X is not a hot CPU. So
I was going to say that was one of the craziest things, because you pointed out that AnandTech has this fantastic discussion of the chips and the architecture, but they were saying, like, they were looking at something like the neighborhood of 32% lower. Well, it manages to showcase 32% lower absolute power than the 2700X, comparing the 2700X and the 3700X.
Yeah.
That's really impressive, to boost clock speeds by 100 megahertz, to boost the amount of work that's being done, and to lower the power consumption. This is the kind of things we were looking at Intel and being amazed by a few years ago, and now AMD is doing it sort of at a much more accelerated pace, it feels like. I mean, that's just a huge drop. How much of that do you think is due to the 7 nanometer process, or moving down to the 7 nanometer process?
We were talking about this here, and it's some of it is 7 nanometer for sure, but the architecture is really where they made these huge leaps in performance. So, like we saw with Radeon 7, you can move down. Essentially, Radeon 7 was a die shrink. It was taking the Vega chip that was shipping in the Vega 64, same configuration. It was still 64 CUs, same number of streaming processors. They increased the memory. They boosted memory throughput because they added 2 more memory channels, that sort of thing. But essentially, you're dealing with the same GPU die, just die shrink down to 7 nanometers and clocked up. So it pulled almost the same amount of power, but they were able to get higher clocks. And when you go down to a smaller process, you can make choices like that. Like, do I want to focus on efficiency? So they could have done this with the 3700X versus the 27. They could have said, let's make something that consumes way, way less power, but still has the same level of performance. And what they were able to do, because this architecture is so much better, Zen 2 versus Zen Plus, it's just not even close. The biggest jump on the charts is going to be going from Zen Plus to Zen 2. Way, way more than we saw from Zen to Zen Plus. Zen Plus was really just a die shrink where they kind of massaged it and got some more performance out of it. And Zen 2 was just all new architecture and way, way more efficient. Everything from the very beginning. Cache is another big one with these. Cache sizes have gone way up, and that helps them. And the way that the CCX units are communicating is different. Everything has been improved, and we've seen the benefit where, like the 3700X, it comes out, it doesn't have to be clocked way up to give you higher performance, but at the same time, because they didn't have to be really, really aggressive with the clocks, they didn't have to take that hit on power, so they could release that part at 65 watts. Now, the higher clock 3800X, that is 105 watt TDP part. Right. And that's where they made that concession from power to just raw performance. And then the 3900X is 105 watts as well. But the amazing thing will be, and however long it takes to get enough of these, since obviously the 3950X will be a higher bend part, that's got all 16 cores enabled and running at higher boost clocks, even though the base clock will be a little bit lower. That's going to be ridiculous at 105 watts. I would love to see how much actual power that pulls, but this just this has basically obliterated the market. I mean, I say that, and of course, anybody who's watching at Intel or anybody who has Intel systems and they have spent $1,200, $2,000 or more, $3,000 on a CPU doesn't want to hear that this $500 CPU is eating their lunch. But really, Intel has to revisit their high-end desktop pricing at this point, because a 12-core, 24-thread part from Intel is $1,200. So for $1,200, I can buy a 3900. In theory, I could buy a 3900X a decent motherboard in the $200 to $300 range, memory, storage, and a cheap case and power supply, and throw a system together. So it's for enthusiasts, this is an amazing time. And I wasn't around for, I wasn't covering this stuff when Athlon first came out, or when the Athlon XPs were kind of dominating things in the enthusiast circles, and Pentium 4 was considered kind of a slow platform, especially the initial launch where it was using Rambus before they went to DDR2 or DDR. So, I mean, there have been times in history where AMD was the lean and fast enthusiast platform, especially for gamers. And then it was like the Core came out. Core 2 Duo was what got me back onto Intel. And it's been several years where every build I did was Intel. And, Bulldozer, Pile Driver, those were disappointing to say the least. Terrible memory performance, bad overall performance, architectural issues, and it's kind of all changed. And I think their only real complaint about Zen before, and one of the things that Intel would have been quick to point out, was like the CCX to CCX, like the actual, they were basically like NUMA nodes. You had different CPUs communicating with each other over memory. And so performance was greatly affected by memory frequency. It's far less so with these new processors. Clearly, using faster memory is going to be an advantage. And AMD would love it if you would run at 3600. And they sent out 3600 memory with the review kits. But I was running all my tests at 3200 with some G-Skill memory that's been around here for a while for testing APUs. And it ran perfectly fine and was very competitive with Intel on a clock-for-clock basis. Even though, and I know I've been talking for a while, but even though if you actually look at gaming benchmarks, that's where Intel still has the advantage. So if you are absolutely gaming first, I don't care about multi-threaded workloads, I don't care about rendering, I just want to play games at the absolute highest frames per second, then you would still buy an Intel processor, which that's probably not what AMD fans want to hear, but it's not huge. It's not the big lead it was before, but the 9900, yeah, it's tangible. You can see it on the charts. Look at anybody's review. If you're gaming at lower resolutions, whereas that's when you're really forcing it to be more CPU bound, that's when you can prove that, okay, yeah, Intel still does have the advantage with gaming.
It's interesting to look at, because you're getting, one on like the Far Cry 5, which is kind of funny. The 3700X is 3.8 frames per second faster than the Ryzen 7 3700, or the 3700X is 3.8 frames per second faster than the Ryzen 9 3900X. But you're looking at 142 frames per second, almost 20 frames per second faster for an i9 9900K. But you're paying a lot more money for that. No, actually, you're not. I take that back.
Well, it depends on which one you go with. Yeah, if you were to go with the 3700X, it's only 329. So
yeah.
And Intel's actually the better overall performance ended up being the i9 or the i7 9700K, which is that sort of interesting 8-core non-hyper-threaded part. So the performance of that, if you're talking about like software mitigations or some of these mitigations they've had to put into place, and I was running all of this. Part of the reason this was such a daunting task was I had to redo every benchmark. Couldn't reuse anything old because I had to start from scratch on 1903, the newest version of Windows 10, which had scheduling improvements for Ryzen and also had more of the mitigations, coupled with the fact that I had the latest BIOS updates on these boards.
Right.
So even so, the 9700K just kind of blasts through gaming because it's just 8 fast cores, no SMT. No worries there. And it's kind of the better chip. If I was just going to buy an Intel chip today, and actually I might be using the 9700K on the gaming test bench going forward. But, but still, I mean, the differences in frame times and overall frames per second averages between the latest Ryzen. We haven't tested any Ryzen 5 yet. I have a Ryzen 5 that'll be coming soon. But it's pretty minimal. It's not like a 20% disparity like it was in the beginning when Ryzen first came out. So if we're talking single digit disparity, and you're getting much higher productivity, much higher like workstation stuff. It's the same story that we've been talking about for the last 6 months, 8 months on this podcast, which is more cores for less money. And until Intel changes their product stack, until they change pricing, revisit HEDT somehow, and HEDT being like the sort of step down Xeon parts that we've always been able to get, like Ivy Bridge E and Skylake E and all of those hyper expensive, extreme edition processors that are out there. But, this changing the game, $499 to $749 when the 3950X comes out, that's going to be a crazy part too.
Shrout's Law, the sub 10% price per gigabyte on laptops. There's some interesting stuff. Memory prices seem to be falling, as in demand is falling and capacity is finally at a place where there is enough capacity to create an excess of memory. We've heard about some companies throttling back their production to help keep prices up. Tom's Hardware had a nice link, or I should say Tom's Hardware took inspiration from a DRAM Exchange post. But first up, traditional rotating hard drives are pretty much dead, and DRAM Exchange said earlier this week that they expect 512 gigabyte and 1 terabyte SSDs to be below 10 cents by the end of this year, or I should say 10 cents per gigabyte by the end of this year. And there's a fantastic quote, if you're into sort of marketing, economic business speak. Weakened stocking momentum due to the cautious stance of PC, smartphones, and service data center OEMs towards the end market sales and high inventory levels, leading to an overly oversupplied NAND flash market, price wars by leading SSD suppliers who are keen to get their 64-72-layer stocks off their hands, and the price comparison effect as a result of Intel 3D QLC SSDs.
Yes.
So what that essentially means, whether or not you're looking at the original article up on DRAM Exchange or Tom's Hardware analysis of that, is that 128 gigabyte SSDs finally are going to die the wasting death they should have met a few years ago, because 512 gigabyte SSD prices are going to drop. So that should be kind of the new standard for entry level, which is great if you're trying to buy affordable systems. And of course, hard disk drives are what little advantage they have in capacity, unless you're going for a big 2 terabyte, 4 terabyte drive, they are probably just going to fall off the face of the planet by the end of this year and the beginning of next year. I'm really kind of curious to see how this ends up. DRAM Exchange is a division of TrendForce, and the NAND flash industry this year is clearly exhibiting signs of oversupply. So 3 cheers for price wars too, between vendors. Mainstream 128, 256, 512 SSDs have fallen a long way by over 50% since peaking in 2017. So this is pretty awesome. I'm pretty excited about this. Do you care?
How much? I do, because at this point, I don't know if that's true as of this second as I say this, but in the last few months, the only SSD you've been able to buy at about 10 cents per gig that was a modern like NVMe M.2 drive, PCI Express storage, was that QLC Intel drive, the 600p.
Right.
And that's been driving pricing down, I think, at least to some extent. That sits there at $99 all the time on Amazon and Newegg and everywhere. And then you have these other options that might be using TLC memory or flash storage, I should say, and might have faster overall performance, like significantly faster random performance. And those prices have been dropping and dropping. I haven't quite seen them down to that 10 cent level, but if that's what we get to, if it's just going to be a commodity thing to just go out and buy a TLC 512 gig drive for 10 cents a gigabyte, that's going to be a great thing for consumers, obviously. And it's absolutely possible to back a QLC drive into the corner where, depending on what you're doing, it might have about the same performance as a hard drive.
Right.
Or in some cases, possibly even lower performance than a spinning hard drive. But that's why I'd like to see more options than just that one Intel 600p that's been sitting there at 10 cents a gig. So that's good.
Well, looking at Amazon, right? Samsung still has a fairly hefty premium compared to a bunch of the other drives out there on sort of the 860 level, right? 860 Evo at 1 terabyte is $140. Crucial MX 500, $97. Western Digital Blues are $110. SanDisk is back up to 115. They were a little bit lower. I don't know. It's been interesting because the prices have been. If you're watching the video, you're seeing me make this hand gesture that looks like some sort of water snake or porpoise bounding through the waves. But the prices have been really, at least in the last couple of weeks, the ones I've been looking at, they've been kind of messy. They've been up and down and up and down. But, to think of where 1 terabyte drives were a year ago versus where they are right now, it's a pretty healthy drop. I'm very curious to see how a lot of this shakes out, because it's funny because some people are still trying to sell like Samsung 840s online for what I would call a somewhat inflated price for what it's worth. The other thing that TrendForce talked about was that PCIe is essentially going to replace SATA in the mainstream because the pricing on those drives have gone down so far. I don't know. I'm excited for all rotating media drives to go away, at least until I have to recover data from a dead drive. Then I remember why I back everything up.
I still like my cold storage. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to buy huge hard drives. You can buy an 8 terabyte external drive when they're on sale for around $140, $150.
Right.
Actually, I think I saw 10 terabyte drives a couple months ago on sale for like $159. So
that's
if you're just going for very big external storage, that was a Western Digital Easy Store drive at Best Buy, I think. But yeah, they fluctuate. I'm sure you'll see stuff by the end of the year that's around $150 for that much storage, but that's the appeal. Yeah.
Western Digital Reds are not going away for NAS boxes for anybody anytime soon. Certainly not for me. Oh, no. I'm not, going to replace the 6 and 10 gigabyte drives. I should say on one NAS I have 4 and 6 gigabytes, and the other NAS 10 gigabyte drives that are populating that simply because A, the capacity isn't there at the high end, and B, the cost is prohibitive. Ryan's Kentucky Special. K series, of course, means it's unlocked. Do we know what the S actually means? Or are we just going to name it the K Shrout?
I've been calling it the Kentucky Shrout since it was released, or since they announced it. They announced this way back at Computex. I think it was the first time we heard about it publicly.
Right.
So we've been waiting since March to get hands-on with this thing. And I assume the S stands for Special Edition, or maybe S for Speed. It's funny, though, because they have all of these letters at the end of products, like the F letter means that it has no graphics, of course. I don't know why F, but anyhow.
F
this is
graphics.
This is F foregoing graphics. This literally is the KS, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a pre-binned, pre-overclocked, very, very special version of the 9900K, the i9 processor that's already been out for months now. And they've set up these CPUs to run at a minimal frequency, a base frequency of 4 gigahertz, which is 400 megahertz faster than the i9 9900K. So you're just getting a free overclock out of the box. But then when it turbo boosts, the turbo boost behavior is different than it is with the regular K. That's the big deal with this. They're talking about 5 gigahertz, all cores all the time. And that's because with the 9900K, it would turbo boost up to 5 gigahertz on up to 2 cores. Once you start doing something that takes all of the CPU cores or more than 2, it starts to clock down. You get down to the 4.8s, the 4.6s. So you never see 5 gigahertz on all cores unless you were to manually overclock or run your motherboard's auto overclocking utility. I actually did that with a 9900K, and it took the voltage all the way up to, I think, 1.35 volts to give me 5 gigahertz on all cores all the time. So that's not ideal. The advantage of this product from Intel is it's been pre-selected to overclock without requiring a lot of extra voltage. So these are in that 1.25 volts range, and they don't consume a tremendous amount of power compared to the K. But, you know, we talked about that in the review. The reviews that are out there will have the actual comparison of the wattage this requires. And this is a processor that ships without a factory cooler. Intel absolutely recommends you put a good cooler on this. I recommend something with at least like a 250 watt cooling rating. Not every cooler actually puts a rating. I don't know. Be Quiet does with their Dark Rock Pro 4. They say it'll do 250 watts. That's what I used for this review. But like a 240 millimeter all-in-one cooler or the like. But Patrick, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any benchmarks or anything yet with this, but what would your guess be if you took a 9900K and then you boosted all the cores to 5 gigahertz under load, all other things being equal? You think this is going to beat out Ryzen 9 3900X?
One would hope, but I think Tom's Hardware actually has an answer. I'm going to say, just to be contrarian, that it won't. Just to annoy the snot out of the Kentucky Special or its overseer.
I did a bunch of CPU benchmarks, and it's pretty much the same story we saw before, where most of these benchmarks are multi-thread aware. In fact, all of them, and you're going to get better numbers, lower render times with the extra cores and threads of the Ryzen 9, even though the clock speeds are lower than this product. Where Intel would like to showcase this product is things like gaming and anything that takes advantage of higher single-threaded performance, those higher instructions per clock that they can boast about, because not only do they have a good, solid architecture, but they're running it at a faster speed. And Zen 2 is very close in instructions per clock, the actual IPC performance of the current generation Intel parts. That was the big news about Zen 2, the new core in AMD's products. But,
right.
Intel can build up on their IPC lead with faster clocks, obviously. But just the CPU benchmarks I've run so far, and I'm working on gaming currently, just kind of show the same picture. The KS is faster. Everything identical in the system except for upgrading that CPU. You do get slightly better render times. You get better performance in video encoding. But we're talking about, like 10, 20, 30 seconds here and there in a benchmark. That actually translates into a lot more savings long-term, bigger rendering jobs, bigger encoding jobs. So it's definitely there. It's noticeable. It's a significant improvement. It's not the massive jump in power consumption that I would have expected just from overclocking a K myself. This KS, in my testing, it rose some 50-ish, 54 watts under full load. This is Cinebench all cores benchmark, and that was the peak observed wattage from the wall. So that's not actually what the CPU itself is pulling. I'm sure that's still under 200 watts. There's a lot of overhead to account for the fact that it's an 80 plus gold power supply. It's only about 90% of the power from the walls even going to the system to start with. So when you look at those numbers, it's always a little misleading. But I mean, look at the core or the Ryzen 9 at 209 watts. That's the most it ever drew from the wall during a punishing multi-core benchmark. So they do have a big lead in power consumption, AMD does, with their 7 nanometer process tech. And this KS, it's still built on the same 14 nanometer process as all of their other current desktop parts. And that's not changing probably anytime soon, at least not until next year. So if power is your biggest concern, and actually really if multi-threaded performance is your biggest concern, AMD still has the win. And I think their summary of the performance of this as well, because they've gone through and done all the gaming benchmarks, it's not going to be a huge game-changing experience compared to the 9900K. And we've already seen results with that CPU all over the place from the Ryzen launch on, and comparisons between the 9900K, which is about a $500 part, is currently selling for about $485. I've seen it as low, I think, as $450 at Micro Center now with the launch of this new part. And that was the other thing about this. The new KS, which is a special edition part, I assume will be rather limited availability, but not a giant premium for something that is essentially a very highly binned pre-overclocked part. recommended customer price is between $513 and $524. That is 1,000 quantity purchases by, I'm sure, like a system integrator. If you go out and look for it on retail sites like Amazon, if you're looking at Newegg, I think Newegg had it listed yesterday for $569.99. Micro Center, I think, has had it for around $550 to $570 as well. So not a huge jump. I would have guessed this to be at least $600. So they're a little below that. And, you're getting something that is probably not going to be available forever. So, and I imagine that once availability drops, then we're going to see those prices climb, just like we did with the 3900X, which is still one of those things where you have to catch it when it's in stock to grab it for that $499 MSRP, and then everybody else pumps it up to like $600 or $700. So, in the realm of $500 to $600 processors, I think the KS just increases Intel's lead a little bit for single thread performance and gaming, but it really depends on what you want to use your CPU for, what you want to use your system for.
It seems like, it seems a little underwhelming, to be honest with you. At least it's I'll say flat out, it's kind of pointless if you're not going to overclock. It's kind of crazy, right? The 3900X is fairly commonly available on Amazon at this point. It's got a healthy lead over Amazon, over AMD's Ryzen 9 3900X, but it's not as huge as you'd like, and it kind of, like you said, it kind of falls apart when you get into some fairly serious multi-threaded work. Is this theme thin to you? It seems like a lot of sound and fury signifying not a whole lot. Is that an unfair categorization of this? Do you feel it's, I'm not as excited as I'd like to be about this part.
Yeah, anytime they come out with something that's going to, it sounded more impressive leading up to the launch for sure. I can understand thinking this is a bit underwhelming, because then you look at benchmarks and they're still behind a part that has more cores and threads. So anything multi-thread optimized is still going to go AMD's way. I think it's going to get really interesting once the Core X series parts are available, because that's where they've been really aggressive with core counts, clocks, and pricing relative to their previous generation of high-end desktop parts. So when we get into the 12-core, 24-thread Intel performance at higher clock frequencies than AMD, then I think it's going to get really interesting. But then those are also more expensive parts than this. So this is like a $570 desktop part, which is, I'm sure their target is the ultimate gaming CPU. So, you know, the 10980X, right? It's special edition, has special packaging. Now, reviewers received this fancy, it looks like a gift box, which has a fabric pull tab, sort of a satin fabric pull tab here, bonded paper, a satin finished bonded paper over the box. I'm being a little facetious, but you know, inside we have the what do they call this shape? It's hexagonal. It's like a something dodecahedron.
Dodecahedron.
Okay, so the the fancy packaging in here, if the camera would actually focus on it, and you know, they even included a little bag. So if I wanted to carry this fancy processor around with me, I guess I could put it in this fabric bag with the Intel logo on it. But you know, some of that price has to be that fancy box, right? At least $5, I would say. It does not come with a cooler. As big as the packaging is, there's no cooler in there because you would not want to use a small air cooler with this. AMD ships a cooler with everything, so that if that matters to you, that saves you a little bit more money. I really think traditionally AMD was always sort of the value choice, and that's still the case. Intel is making a case for, we have absolutely the best single-threaded performance on desktop right now because we have 5 gigahertz. And, you know, AMD cannot say that, but there's no arguing with core count. And even a 4 gigahertz core if you have 12 of them, it's going to be faster than a 5 gigahertz core if you only have 8 of them. So, and I say core, I guess I mean CPU. I should probably stop talking now. I've had very little sleep the last 2 nights.
Okay, Sebastian, 2020 is around the corner, practically within arm's reach. What are you looking forward to other than dozens of new GPUs that will fill the $5 gaps in pricing next year?
Please no. What I'm actually looking forward to, and some GPU stuff, first of all, I want to see the trend continue with more and more desktop and notebook CPU cores. I think this is great. AMD is really pushing Intel to increase their core counts as well. So seeing higher and higher numbers there is something I'm excited about. But on the GPU side, on the gaming side, more competition and real competition for NVIDIA in especially the high-end GPU space. I can't wait for this thing we've been calling Big Navi all year. I want to see what that architecture can do when you scale it up to compete with the likes of the RTX 2080 Super and the 2080 Ti. And then just kind of continuing on from last year, what Alan had talked about, more bigger, faster, and cheaper SSDs. I'm talking NVMe SSDs. We've already seen the 10 cent per gigabyte barrier broken this year.
Right.
And that was on the budget side. I want to see the high performance stuff at like 1 and 2 terabytes really come down. I would love to see, 6-7 cents a gigabyte. And I think we're maybe another year away from some of that, but that's what I'm looking forward to. I'd love to see announcements at CES where prices are coming down and AMD comes on stage and they've got the RTX 2080 Super Killer and all of that. So, I'm not asking for much. I just want, complete transformation of the entire PC hardware space. That's all.
Okay, so I'm looking right now at like the price of Samsung's 860 EVO 2 terabyte drive, and it's kind of crazy. This is something that launched at $400. It's selling for like $230, which is so close to 10 cents a gigabyte. As you get into larger capacity drives, like the 4 terabyte drive, well, okay, that launched at $900. It's down to $580, so not quite as close to 10 cents a gigabyte. But I see no reason, I hope there's no reason that SSD drives, and admittedly, these are affordable, relatively low-end drives, but NVMe prices should get lower, SSD prices should get lower. I think it's going to be a good year for hardware next year. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind you one last time before the end of the year, twit.tv/Twitch is the page to get all of the older episodes, the links, the audio, the video. We can help you subscribe on just about any platform on the planet, or just search for This Week in Computer Hardware on your favorite podcatcher. I'm Patrick Norton.
And I'm Sebastian Peak.
We'll catch you next week on Twitch.